And today we are really excited. Julia Debes from Working Lands for Wildlife is joining us today to talk about organizational buy-in to communications. It's just that idea of engaging your whole team in communications. Julia is the director of agricultural communications for Working Lands for Wildlife and is just a powerhouse of collaborative communications and putting stuff out there. So today she's going to share some tips and tricks, and yeah, take it away, Julia. Thank you for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily and Nicole. Really happy to be here, and great to see some familiar faces and a lot of new ones too. I want to give a special shout out as I begin. Tara Gray, who is the multimedia specialist with Working Lands for Wildlife, is also on here. So you'll get to see some of her handiwork and get to explain how our team comes together. But there's no way we would be a powerhouse without the efforts of her and our other folks that are on our communications team. So I'll go ahead and get the screen set up and make sure I've got all the correct buttons pushed. So my goal in this conversation today is just kind of take you behind the scenes at Working Lands for Wildlife and share a little bit about how our communication process works, how our team functions, and how we really have communications buy-in from top to bottom, and then talk through some examples of how that's come into play and how things get put together. A little bit about myself. So this is kind of my life in a nutshell. So I am the fifth generation at home on my family's operation in central Kansas, so right in the heart of the Great Plains. We do have about 200 head of a red Angus cow-calf herd, which makes my work with Working Lands for Wildlife directly applicable. I'm my own target audience when it comes to talking about producers and the importance of conservation on private working lands. My husband actively works with my father, and you can see my three little members of hopefully the sixth generation that are participating in the farm that really drive what we do. I've been with Working Lands for Wildlife for about 2.5 years now. Prior to that, and prior to moving home to the farm, my husband was active duty Air Force, and so we bounced around a lot of the countryside. I have a degree in agricultural communications and a master's degree in media studies, and I've bounced around from working anything from state agencies to political campaigns. A really good chunk of my experience has been in international agriculture, and happy to come and be able to focus a little bit more instead of on the cropping and the international side to talking about the grass in my backyard. So very excited to be here today. I am going to kick off with one of pieces of Tara's handiwork, just for folks that might not be as familiar with Working Lands for Wildlife, or who are familiar with Working Lands for Wildlife in the West, but maybe not in the Great Plains, or in the Great Plains, but not in the sagebrush steppe. So just a quick little video, and I promise there's a reason I'm playing it that sets up this conversation quite nicely.
For me, why I want to keep doing this is that there is an immense amount of joy in being tied to a land that is improving. And so trying to understand what a person can do within their lifetime, change or a difference. People in agriculture are in a very unique position to do it at a really large scale.
There's so much demand on scientists and extension time, you oftentimes don't get that lessons learned across state boundaries either. So what this is doing, it's opened up a pathway where we have collaborations of every land-grant institution tied to extension, growing research tied to it. And in the future, you could see where we could start tying these lessons learned of teaching. So that's what starts to get impressive. The benefit then gets passed on to producers, the industry, both from cattle standpoint, wildlife standpoint, and a conservation standpoint. But we're really starting to tap into the expertise that occurs across states from science, extension, agency.
We're working with those ranchers on preserving the grasslands that we have. Grasslands are being eliminated at an alarming rate, and we want to save what we can. There's only 4% of the original native prairie grasslands left, and so we're doing our best, and those ranchers are really doing their part to preserve those, whether that's through prescribed burning, whether that's through rotational grazing efforts, and again, making sure that those grasslands don't get converted. That's where we'll lose the carbon, that's where they lose a lot of their bottom line. So making sure those grasslands stay intact from an economic standpoint is really important.
Don't be afraid to jump in with both feet. Talk to all your partners. There's other people out there in your community, other agencies that will help you. Bring everybody to the table, talk about what you want to do, talk about your overall broad concept, and it will come together. But don't be afraid to move forward and try something, because it is possible.
Sagebrush landscapes are part of that natural and cultural heritage out here, and my hope is that through this type of restoration work we will have those places where people can go and see what it was once like 150, 200 years ago, and still natural, still supporting abundant wildlife while also supporting the working landscapes, the agriculture and livestock communities that sustain our rural economies.
So I promise this will all tie in together about why that is important and why this video is important. But that was a little primer that we just had from our workshop that we had in Manhattan. That was Tara's handiwork to put that together. And that was compiled of several different video shoots that we've done over the past 2 years with partners to pull together some great communications messages. And I'll talk a little bit about why it's important to connect all those dots and how they appear in these pieces in just a couple of minutes. But as you might have picked up from the video, Working Lands for Wildlife is an approach of the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So our agreement from NRCS ties into Pheasants Forever, who manages our agreement. And through that agreement, our staff works, as you can see, everything west of the Mississippi is what I call it here in Kansas. I've been told there's a couple places in Iowa that we don't cover, but it's easier for me geographically to use the Mississippi River. So the work that we do is focused on voluntary incentive-based conservation on private lands. We do several projects with the BLM and with other sources on public lands, partnering with the joint venture. But our primary focus is on those private working lands. So primarily working with ranchers, landowners, practitioners, field staff, all of that, all of those great target audiences and communities. And that really has helped pull together that idea of collaborative conservation, because we do have so many different aspects of the conservation community that we work with, that we naturally have that idea of like, how can we partner on things? How can we work on things together, not just on a programmatic level, but also on a communications level. It's really important for us to have a really unified goal when it comes to our communications and to our programs. And it's very nicely outlined. We have 2 frameworks for conservation action, one which is focused on the sagebrush biome and one on the Great Plains grasslands. We recently just announced that we will be doing a 3rd this fall on migratory big game. So it's also working in Montana, Idaho, Wyoming. That has a pilot project right now that's going to be expanded. But under those frameworks, these are the 4 primary threats that we have identified, and each of our different pieces of communications and the work that we do ties back to one of these 4 threats. You heard a little bit about why grasslands are being lost. You saw some great riparian restoration from a video that Little Wild did with support from the joint venture and ourselves. That was a fantastic project, and a lot of different other topics that we cover, but I don't want to get too much into that. This is our staff. This is from our workshop that we came into in Manhattan. And this is important to understand how our team is structured and how communications has a tie-in at each different level of how our organization is structured. So this is our head honcho, Ted Griffiths, who is the Western lead for Working Lands for Wildlife. He is an NRCS badge wearer, has been for a long time. And I call him one of the OGs of SGI. So the Sage Grouse Initiative back in 2010 was one of the original folks to start. So he kind of helps drives our policy and ties back into, you know, USDA headquarters and overarching USDA initiatives. And he has done a really fantastic job of fostering a team environment that is focused on bringing all of the different elements of our different 4 teams together in order to really pull that through. And that makes for a lot more successful communication efforts as we go along. Our first team that we have kind of under Tim is our science team. So again, not all of our folks work for the same agency. Very few of our folks actually work in the same locations. So the green circles here are our science folks, primarily based at the University of Montana and the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. But we have folks as far as Florida and Wisconsin. And as you heard Duroc talk about the 10 different states in the Great Plains, these are the guys that are focusing up our science arm. So they're working on making sure that we have the best understanding of why grass is important, what we need to do in order to conserve those grass and shrublands across the American West. And they have a great job when it comes to that idea of needing to communicate at every step of the way. So when they have publications that are coming out, when they have, you know, different conferences that they're speaking at, that we're constantly in a loop communicating about kind of their latest and greatest news that is coming out of their shops. Our second shop that ties into, and I've got a couple of different folks on here, is our tech transfer team that's headed up by Jeremy Maestas out of the West Tech Center. You saw him in the video. So this is the team, and then I've got 2 other blue circles here that I want to highlight. This is the team that takes that science, which is all co-produced with our tech transfer folks, and says, okay, this is what the science is saying. How do we actually implement and put that science onto the ground and make it work? So again, when it comes to communications, we're in touch here on when there are workshops, when there are field trainings, not just in, hey, I need a postcard, but like, hey, we had this discussion, we had this story, we met this rancher, we should highlight that story. And that idea of really elevating stories to come back and filter into our communications team and deciding how we're going to elevate all of those different communication items. I also have on here the gentleman in the green shirt, that's to the far side of the screen, and the blue circle is with Pheasants Forever. So we do have all of those touch points again with Pheasants Forever plugging into some of their channels. And then the person in the center is Dean Crable, who's the state resource conservationist with Kansas NRCS, which is yet another one of our touch points, both on a program, both on a science and on a communication scale of saying, okay, so we have all of these different state NRCS offices. How do we tie into their efforts? How do we provide them materials for their newsletter? How do we best support initiatives that they have coming up and tie all of those together? Our third team is our outcomes team. So we have science, we're putting that science into the field, and then Thad Heater, who's based out of Reno, Nevada, is an NRCS badge wearer and says, okay, so what did you do with all of that? What did that really result in? And tracking that information on not just how many acres, how many landowners did we work with, but really, are we making a difference on the landscape, and what does that really mean in the larger context? So we're tracking that process all the way through, and then that's where our communication staff comes in, is that we have an intersection with each of those teams continuously as we go along in conversations about what is going on, what information can we help support, what can we provide, and then each of these people serve as a direct conduit that then feeds us back information that says, okay, we need to add this to the editorial calendar. We have a science publication coming up in the next 6 months. Really open channels of communication. And that's really the underpinning of how our communications and our collaboration works, is that from the top down, we have agreement that all of us are going to be in this together. We have a core team that all feeds information up from the individuals working on their teams to those touch points. We have a regular bi-weekly call where we talk about issues. But despite being a fully remote team since 2010, I would say that the biggest surprise I had meeting most of these people in Manhattan earlier this month was the difference in height that people have, because on Zoom, we're all the same height. Everybody's head's in the same frame. So it's maybe that's just a short person's perspective, but like seeing how tall or short someone is in person was more of a shock than it was meeting and dealing with this team that met in person for the first time this July, despite having worked together. So several of these folks have worked together for a long time. Others of the team, I had only met 3 members of this team in person before this July, despite working for the organization for 2.5 years. So post-COVID, we're going to make that happen more often. But that's a little bit about how our team is set up and kind of setting that top-down philosophy that involving communications at every step in the process is really important to each of our team members. I also think it is the philosophy of how our team sets its goals that really makes that collaborative communications possible. And this is a little bit of the Venn diagram that we use in order to determine where we're going to put conservation on the ground. And I think there's a couple different pieces of this that really buy into why we have such a great communications channels. The first of that is this idea of cultural will. So looking at places where there are active voices, and those active voices are important not just for actually getting people to sign up for programs, but also those active voices are your advocates on the ground level, and those people that are willing to step up, put their stories forward, talk to someone, identify other people in their community that they think they should elevate. And so that idea of we're working not just, where the science says we should work, not just where we have tie-ins to our wildlife habitats and grass habitats, but also that like, where are people really hungry to get involved? And so we already have this process of identifying where people are going to be strong advocates on a grassroots level for helping put together a prescribed burn association or helping people sign up for the migratory big game pilot project. But that also directly translates then into identifying those people and moving them through the channel that they come up to our level to say, hey, we need to highlight someone in a video. Hey, we need to go visit someone's ranch and really tell their story. And so that idea of cultural will directly applies. The idea that's more philosophical that I want to talk a little bit about is the idea of looking for intact landscape cores. So when we talk about defend the core, grow the core, which if you are familiar with Working Lands for Wildlife, we say a lot. It's this idea of you start where you have the biggest strongholds, and then you gradually move out from there. So basically you shore up and you identify where your strongest pieces of, in this case, in grasslands are, and then you start working your way out from that core. And so it's flipping it to saying, instead of being more reactive, more of like an ambulance, like where is the worst places to go do conservation on the ground, we focus more on proactive preventative care, saying, okay, where is the best grass? How do we preserve that? And then how do we slowly start to build those cores over time? For example, in woody encroachment, the old philosophy might have been to say, okay, where is our tree infestation the heaviest? We need to go take out all of those trees. And then our science community really was like, that's really not working. And our people on the ground are like, yeah, we're fighting a losing battle. We take out these trees in a couple years, they're all back. And so the science really identified with the feedback on the ground that we needed to address seed sources, not just where there were big, heavy trees, but also making sure we were taking care of seeds. And so our philosophy as an organization completely flipped to saying, okay, we need to go to the place where we have the best grass, and we need to make sure trees don't come in there. And then we need to identify, oh, there's a tree on the fence post, we need to take care of that tree. And so slowly building out that area and the influence, while at the same time containing those heavy areas. And this sounds like a lot of science and a lot to transfer, but here's how it applies to communications. So in the same way that we are identifying where our strongest pieces in the American West are, our strongest producers, our sage-grouse habitat, our lesser prairie chicken leks, our strongest where we've got great field staff that's really putting stuff into the ground. In the same way, we've adapted that to communications to say, where do we have the strongest relationships? Where do we have the most dedicated audiences? Where do we have those people that are really going to step up and communicate that information back to us? And we focus and double down on those areas first. And then we start slowly trying to build our influence and our reach as we expand out from that group. So apparently I like circles. So we'll do another circle set of charts. And so when we started developing strategic communications plans, within Working Lands for Wildlife. And as we started to build our team, we thought about people in the same way as that cultural will piece of it, only we have flipped it, and instead of signing up for a conservation program, how does that apply to communications? So on the left is kind of where we started as an inventory, saying, okay, we identified these different target audiences. I think we did an exercise where we identified 6 different audiences: a rancher, a district conservationist, a field staff, a research scientist, and then we called it, I think, conservation community minded public. So a hunter or a hiker or someone like that, and then the general public. And we talked about, you know, really diving into those user journeys of how those people think, where those people get their information from, who influences the information that they receive, what are the best channels. So for example, our research scientists, you know, probably are more active on Twitter or LinkedIn, but they're more than likely not on Instagram. Or our NRCS employees and our field staff are way more likely to open up something that comes onto their desktop or into their inbox than they are to go out to a site on a mobile. They're going to be at their desktop first. And so we really delved into those target audiences and did a lot of work understanding who they are, what motivates them, what media they consume, in order to start developing our really strategic communications efforts. And it's something that was already kind of inherent in the organization because we're already had that cultural will aspect and that long experience of dealing with folks on the ground, just applying it in a slightly different way. And then the second component that we really took a gander at is not just understanding who those people were within our target audiences, but also what level we were able to motivate them on. So the second kind of circle of spheres is, okay, you've identified your people and where they get their information, how you can best tie into them, but then, okay, what actually can you get them to do? Where on these spheres are you actually wanting people to take action? Like, what are you hoping for them to learn and achieve? Is it for them to just have greater awareness of the importance of grasslands? Is it for them to understand how grasslands ties into the carbon conversation or to climate smart agriculture? Is it to get them to sign up for a program? Is it for a research scientist to explore more of our science? Like, what do we want these people to achieve? And so we really spent a lot of time as a group discussing these two aspects of identifying our own communications cores and then starting to say, okay, how are we going to apply communications in that way, identifying that cultural will, putting those cores into place, and then starting to build our efforts out from there. So I'll kind of pause there for a second, Emily, and see if anyone has any questions, because I know this kind of took a little bit of a philosophical slant from who we are and what we do to kind of how we think about the world. So if anybody has any questions on that, I'll talk about that before I'll talk about kind of the flip side of how we put communications into action and what that actually looks like. Okay, I'll go on. You all are going to have great questions here at the end. Okay, so this is the next piece is my new favorite discovery in probably the last year on the way I think about communications. I will admit on StrengthsFinder, I am harmony, connectedness, and belief. So basically, I'm a hippie that lives on a farm. Like, I believe we're all connected in a great sphere. We can find spider webs to everyone else. But how that applies to how I've been able to work professionally in this role is it's saying, okay, no one piece of communications, no one action happens in a vacuum. Everything happens in this greater sphere. And when we talk about communications, how can we plug things in so that they're not just happening one time in place, but how can we use them over and over again and really maximize that content to the folks where our folks are completely tired of hearing about it, but it may be reaching a new target audience in a slightly different way or through a slightly different channel for the very first time. And so I will have credit here at the bottom to Travis Martin. This was in one of his Imagine content and consulting newsletters. This came out of a traditional agriculture, row crop agriculture kind of newsletter that they started called Magnetic Ag. And then he spun off into also providing some tips and tricks on communications. But this idea that was in one of his newsletters is called a content waterfall, which I absolutely love this term. And so that is saying, like, each one of these pieces of content or each communications opportunity that comes by doesn't exist in that silo. That how are we going to continue what our folks talk about as a drip, drip, drip of communications over time? How do we stretch that out? And how do we really maximize every single communications piece that we are putting together to make sure that we are getting our maximum use out of it? And so this content waterfall, this example talks about like, okay, you had a white paper leadership report that you put out. So in our case, a framework that you put out. Okay, well, each of these frameworks has different threats under them. Okay, so each of these, then we start to break that down into a little bit further, right? Like moving down these green boxes and like, okay, within this threat, we have the announcement of a new research publication, which led to the development of a pocket guide, which led to a workshop. And at each one of those intersections, it starts to become like those quizzes in the back of a teen magazine. That's like, have you published a blog article about this? Have you put this out on social media? Have you done this? And I think Hannah's on the line. I think Hannah and Emily do a fantastic job in their communications plans, and it's really helped me kind of think about formalizing that process of like, okay, how do we inventory every single piece of communication that's going to come out of each of these different kind of milestones in the life of a communications product? And how do we really make sure that whether it's an internal email or a social media post or something that we're really continuing to develop and really maximize is always my word that I use, that or recycling content, as it says, recycling and repurposing and being more efficient and effective with what we do. And I'll talk about a couple of examples from that. But the result of this, when we talked about, and this process that we've overgone over the last 2 years of doing this, really help us formalize kind of how we work within a team. Our team is kind of like, oh, okay, not everything that we do is going to be the single touch point. We're going to have all of these things that come after it. Even if I don't see those particular pieces, those pieces are happening. And that became a big sellback piece or justification piece for shooting a video or sponsoring someone else or partnering together on a video, or, you know, putting together a podcast episode, or helping support a workshop. And that helped our team buy in to see this content waterfall and to see it really formalized in some ways, to understand and to give the numbers too, right? So if I'm saying that our CEO is giving a keynote in front of an audience of 200 people, right, then that's one thing. But then if I add to, Tara has taken that speech and put out clips of it and put it out on social media and add that number of people that have seen that from these particular audiences. And oh, we did a blog post and that went out in the newsletter. And you start to like roll through and show the impact of a single piece of communications. That really helped with the sell back to our larger leadership group to say, oh, okay, now I see just how much impact this is getting across different mediums, even though I only gave this keynote at a speech and maybe I caught the article in the newsletter. I didn't realize all of these other things were happening at the same time, but then their eyes kind of popped open for that. So today what we have now is, I call it the Cheesecake Factory menu of communications. So we take all of those possibilities, right, across our different social media channels, across our different e-news platforms that we have, across our website, across our partners' communications. You know, we have this huge laundry list of kind of a menu that we can pick and choose from when it comes to selecting how we're going to repurpose and recycle and how long we're going to stretch that piece of content off. Obviously, for every single thing that we do, we don't use the entire menu, right? Like you don't go to Cheesecake Factory and order, I mean, if anybody orders an appetizer, an entree, a salad and a piece of cheesecake, then oh my gosh, I envy your metabolism, because I would love to do that. So the process that we started as an informal development because we just had questions, is because we're a fully remote team. We don't have the opportunity to, you know, walk down to someone's office and pick one person's brain. And so we really have a system where we started out with such a small staff and we've been growing over time to say, okay, folks, come together, let's put our heads together. So they started calling it jam sessions with Julia, which so it's the idea of like, let's get the band together, let's talk about this. And so what started as a process of just like, okay, like here's an update on this paper, this is coming out here, we're going to do this, then it really became like that, okay, what do we want to achieve? Like, why did you put this piece of science together? Why are we speaking at this event? Why is this podcast important? And then being like, okay, so let's pick some items off the menu and let's start putting together a communications plan and putting that plan into action, whether it's in different phases over a long period of time or just a couple pieces in a short period of time. So kind of, I'll give you a couple examples of how this works out, and then we can open this for communications. So one of the pieces of communication that we identified was needed was some sort of breaking news alert when we had new science that was released. So that didn't exist. We have a monthly e-news platform. So that really didn't give that like breaking news kind of feel that people wanted to like, I want to get the science into folks' hands as quickly as possible. And so we developed a piece of our communications arsenal called a publication alert. It's a basic e-news blast. It goes out, it has a list of over, it's getting close to 680 folks. So shooting for 700 soon, but it's a pretty tight list as far as an e-news platform kind of goes. But the reason is because that's the most impactful people that need the science in their hands. So the idea on this publication alert is that it gives the abstract, it gives the journal, it gives the link. All of our journal articles that we submit are open access, so people can immediately go do it. It pulls out a relevant figure. And then we built kind of a little communications blurb that gave a little bit more of a layman's version of the abstract, like what was this research doing, who supported it, and then gave us a direct tie-in back to our frameworks and said, okay, like this is where this piece of science fits into this bigger community. So when it comes to our scientific releases, sometimes this is all we do. So for example, for this paper has some longer term strategy on it, but for the moment, all we did was send out an email alerting people, putting that onto our website. So it's on our website, wrapping that into an e-news, letting Tara take it out on social media and talk about a little bit of that science. And so this one was a very strategically targeted kind of piece that had a much smaller imprint and was all done kind of within house. And so I just threw this in here that this is probably our most successful publication alert we've sent out. 74% open rate is definitely not something that we see very often. We're usually sitting somewhere above 25 to 30 is a pretty good open rate for us. So to have 74%, this obviously was a hot piece of science, and it was obviously hitting exactly the right target audience. And that's kind of, for this one, that was that kind of goal. Keep it tight. It's a relevant piece of science. We need it out in the scientific community. We're not yet ready to put this out into a broader sphere. There's not really something that we're targeting field staff to doing. This is really just a really nerdy science piece that we need to get out to other research scientists to start this conversation, because this conversation is happening and we need this kind of flag put in the ground. So that was this piece that was kind of a smaller piece. Going one that was a little larger, so and Emily and Hannah will be very familiar with this one, is you saw in the very first video, the very first rancher that was speaking and the great riparian footage that came through was one of two videos that we helped provide a few dollars for shooting for with Little Wild and the Intermountain West joint venture that were focused on riparian restoration efforts. In this case, they were on public lands. So the rancher that was speaking, actually, and Hannah and Emily, feel free to correct me if I'm, because it's more of your rancher than our rancher. But so we, in this case, we came together as a partner community. And I know they've probably talked about these videos before and just how successful they've been. The Dixie Creek video went viral, and they really had that magic sauce to really pull off some really great things. Both of them have won awards at film festivals. And so when it came to our piece of it, so we took a look at the broader scheme of communications and what our goals were for participating in it. So this came out of a jam session that we had with our tech transfer lead that said, okay, like, we're supporting this video. Why are supporting this video? What do we hope to get out of it? What do we want our target audiences to get out of it? So really letting our partners drive what they do best. So Hannah and Emily, and pushing it out through their communication channels. And then how can we augment or add to that, and add to that kind of content waterfall, instead of competing, making complementary. And so this was a feature that's pretty popular within our kind of field staff conservation practitioner audience, called an Ask an Expert. So in this case, we connected with Carol Evans, who was the lead in helping make these videos come together, and talking more about how do they actually implement riparian restoration on the ground. And then at the bottom of this piece, if you went through the big Ask an Experts, then we're including the videos, we're including linking back to other resources. So this is kind of providing our peg in the larger wheel of how this piece came together. So this was a good example of how, when we looked at our Cheesecake Factory menu, we said, okay, actually, we're not the best people to make the initial communications product. Like Little Wild has the secret sauce. They do great things. We want to support them. And, you know, in this case, the joint venture has the secret sauce to having a video go viral. So we're going to let them drive the ship. So how can we add to that effort? And so in this case, we added this Ask an Expert piece, which was really popular within our team, to kind of add to that arsenal and to that content waterfall. And then the last one I'll talk about just really briefly, and sorry, I'm talking a little longer than I should, I apologize, but this last piece was a really great collaboration effort and a really huge lift that we had the opportunity with an NRCS lead for the National Grazing Lands Coalition that works with NCBA on some sponsorships for some of their programs that come along with having some segments on NCBA's program on RFD-TV called Cattleman to Cattleman. And so that person within RCS said, hey, I've been hearing a lot about Working Lands for Wildlife now through, you know, the newsletters I get and through seeing some of the different initiatives that have been launched on the different states. Like, how could we partner together? I have content that I need to produce. Could you help me identify some for some segments? And what it started out as is, hey, we get 4 to 6 segments a year, and the Great Plains Grasslands Initiative has 4 states. So why don't we feature each one of those 4 states in a segment? And so we had one of our jam sessions and said, okay, like, who would be the best states to represent, like in the 4 states? Where should we start? Who would we suggest? And we went into a discussion with Cattleman to Cattleman, and they turned back and said to us and said, oh, hey, we don't want to do just one segment. We want to do an entire special episode. And so the result from that was that this is our roadmap of last summer and last fall. We ended up shooting video in each of the 4 states to produce an entire special episode entirely focused on reducing woody encroachment on private lands in the Great Plains. And the great part about how this was structured is with that partnership is working with Cattleman to Cattleman, we had the foresight to say, okay, we get all of the footage, all of the raw footage that you shoot, and all of the interview footage. How are we going to use that? We're not just going to produce a television episode. We're gonna really look at how we can maximize this. So from the very beginning, from every shoot that was planned, we went back to that cultural will, right? We went to our states and said, okay, who are your best ranchers that you want to highlight in this? And let them drive the ship on saying, where are we going to go? Who are we going to shoot? Are these the right questions to ask them? And getting that feedback from the very ground level and taking those and putting these shoots together. Then we made sure that every location we went to was not just a rancher, but we had a local NRCS field staff member, and then we had some sort of partner organization where it was appropriate. So we had Halsey National Forest, we had a Pheasants Forever representative. So at each of these, in South Dakota, we had a fantastic absentee landowner and the head of the Prescribed Burn Association and the rancher, all to be able to shoot that video all in one point. And so the result from that was a fantastic special episode, but I'm happy to report, and that episode was phenomenal, an hour-long episode with different segments. We are now in the 2nd year that we said, okay, we have a ton of footage that we shot that didn't include it in that first episode. So can we do more segments? And so this year we are doing additional individual segments. So we've already done one on South Dakota, because that story was touched on but not featured in the first episode. And we've done one that focused on a field day event that we tied into this, where we brought together state conservationists from 4 different states and all had them on camera on a panel talking about that. We're going to have one on virtual fencing, because one of the ranchers we visited happened to be in a pilot project for virtual fencing. And so we shot some additional footage and asked him some additional questions, and that's going to be an additional segment. We're going to have one specifically talking about the tie-in between healthy grasslands and wildlife. It didn't make it into the first episode since it was so focused on woody encroachment, but so many of the interviewees that we had talked about that particular tie-in that we're going to do a segment on that. And so we've got these different segments that are going to be published. Two have already come out, and then we're going to have the others come out later this fall. Then those, when they come to rerun season and they're looking for how to do reruns, they're going to roll all of those different segments up into a special episode. And so the result of this massive amount of work that we did last summer was that we're going to have all of this coverage on Cattleman to Cattleman. But we said, but wait, there's more we can do with the idea of this content waterfall, right? Like, it's not just about the RFDT episode and putting social media out and promoting the episode, getting folks to watch it. We want to do more. How can we do more? And so one of the first things that we did was say, okay, so we have all of the footage from all of these interviews. Let's share those out with our state public affairs specialists. So we sent hard drives to the different state NRCS offices that were involved in the shoots and said, here's a hard drive with all of the footage. Like, you now have a whole photo video library of grasslands, from drone shots to cattle grazing. Like, it's yours. Use this material in your own material. Also turned it over to Tara and said, hey, Tara, you need social media content and stuff to put out. Like, here is a ton of footage to put together. And then this footage combined with 2 other video shoots, one of the Carol Evans Little Wild shoots and a previous video shoot that we did in the Warner Mountains in Oregon, all had the footage that you saw in that first video that we were able to repurpose for our Working Lands for Wildlife workshop where we had sizzle reels that introduced every general session or coming back from a break. So we had a short video. I like to call it like the equivalent of baseball walk-up music, like to come in. It's also a big signal that says, hey, come in, sit down, stop talking, like we're going to start the meeting again. Tara put together 7 of those based on our existing video libraries for this workshop. So again, finding another use, how do we continue to make this information resonate and come across? And it was a phenomenal result that folks were very impressed with. And then we're taking it a step further. So we also, as we talk about our trusted networks and where our core communication cores are, one of those is a really strong relationship with farmers.gov, which is the blog put out by USDA, primarily done by FPAC, which is NRCS and FSA. And so we're taking all of those video interviews and we're turning those video interviews into written stories that will be submitted to farmers.gov, along with these great video interviews and the video component of it, footage of their farms, still images that we took while we were out on shoots, and directly turning that around again and saying, okay, we may have shot these in August 2021. Maybe we have a few updates we need to get from those producers, but why wouldn't we tell these producer stories individually, and why wouldn't we highlight them through yet another channel? So that's probably our like biggest, gnarliest content waterfall, longest living that we've had coming through. So that's kind of 3 examples of something very small, something that was very, very partner driven, where we just added a small piece to a much bigger puzzle, and then something that we definitely made a mosaic out of that content waterfall and really had people spinning with all the different ways that we've used that content. So with that, Emily and Nicole, I will open it up for questions and discussion. Sorry, I took a little bit longer than I had hoped, but hopefully folks found it valuable information, and happy to start any conversations about how this came across pretty informally and how we kind of formalized it over time, and how we get everybody on board with continuing to drive this machine and make it even bigger.